Now, let me introduce our second expert to join us today. Dr. Gavin Helf is a senior expert on Central Asia for the U.S. Institute of Peace. He has taught at several prestigious universities, including Notre Dame, Cornell, the George Washington University, and Moscow International University. He was previously a senior democracy and governance advisor for USAID in Asia and in the Middle East. He has worked for the Eurasia Foundation and International Research and Exchanges Board. Dr. Helf has published several academic papers regarding democratic norms and processes, as well as focused pieces on the post-Soviet region before and after 1991. He is a regular speaker who has been invited to discuss his insights around the world, most notably at the US Military Academy. Dr. Helf's insights will be highly invaluable in assessing the policy of Central Asian states towards their stranded citizens in northeast Syria. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Helf. Dr. Helf, could you please explain how the Jusan operation was carried out by Kazakhstan, and have Uzbekistan and Tajikistan followed their lead? What are the challenges those states have faced, and what are the lessons learned? You have the floor.
Thank you. I love your biography. You brought up things I'd almost forgotten about in my own past. So first of all, I think for those of us who follow Central Asia, the story about repatriation is a good news story coming out of Central Asia. And we don't, for somebody who's been studying this part of the world for several decades, we don't have a lot of great stories coming out of Central Asia. Usually, Central Asia, we get something like, hey, Freedom House says that, oppression of media is down by 10% this year, which is not that great a story. I'm honestly quite proud of the countries of Central Asia for stepping up and taking a lead ahead of the United States, ahead of Europe, in repatriating their people and returning their people from Iraq and Syria to Central Asia in, as you mentioned, Mayor Operation Jusan, the Tajiks, and we'll get into the Kyrgyz later. I think it's a model, and I think it's a very commendable thing. But repatriation is, in a way, the easy part. Everybody likes the pictures of people. Chulpan, you shared one of people coming off of the plane and being greeted back home into the loving embrace of the motherland. I think the harder piece that we've been working on over the last year and a half at USIP has been the reintegration part. And trying to figure out what you do after that picture and that photo op. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the models that we've seen, the different approaches that Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan have adopted in bringing their people home and reintegrating them. I want to talk a little bit about what we've identified working with the governments and caregivers and civil society in the region, identified as the key problems and the key gaps in how those countries can do that reintegration effort. And then I want to talk a little bit about how the situation of reintegration has been impacted by COVID and other developments in the region since these folks came home. So I'm going to be generalizing a little bit in order to sort of make the point, but we've got some very different, we've got quite a spectrum of approaches in Central Asia represented by the three cases of organized state repatriation. First of all, I'm going to start with Kazakhstan, which has taken a very much state-led institutional de-radicalization approach. So for Kazakhstan, I would say the theory of the case is that the people that went to Iraq and Syria that wound up involved with ISIS had been exposed to bad versions of Islam, to Salafi Wahhabi narratives about Islam and that the solution to their situation is a de-radicalization program, which involves a reintroduction to more peaceful local Hanafi versions of Islam. The way that Kazakhstan has approached it is very forward-leaning and institutional. So they've got an induction camp on the Caspian in Western Kazakhstan, where people go through a de-radicalization program, which involves psychosocial assessments, obviously health assessments for physical health issues, and then work with a theologian. So their approach is very much ideological based, and some of the measures of success that we see, the way that the Kazakh system is trying to figure out whether you're having success or failure is, do you have, how many women voluntarily take off their hijabs after 2 weeks in the camp? How many women have learned how to sing a lullaby in the Kazakh language for their children? These are very sort of ideological measures. They've also, I say, put in the most robust infrastructure for when people are reintegrated going home. They have 17 regional centers, one in basically every region of Kazakhstan, that are run through non-governmental organizations, mostly centers that would be familiar to those of us who've worked in the region as women's empowerment centers and women's help centers, a lot of organizations that have worked with trafficking in persons issues previously, but they have a robust program of then follow-on support and tracking for the folks that are then released from those ideological centers. I would say now on the opposite end of the spectrum of the sort of de-radicalization versus pragmatic is Tajikistan. And Tajikistan very much has adopted I would say in my conversations with the folks working on repatriation in Tajikistan, there's very much a conscious rejection of the idea that this is an ideological problem. And I think a lot of that comes from the history of Tajikistan with a civil war in the 1990s that involved, a communist ideology of Soviet ideology on one side and an Islamist ideology on the other side. And I think there's much more of an approach of, well, it's not really about changing what's in people's hearts. It's about changing people's behavior and finding ways to reintegrate people back into normal life and to find ways to live together as neighbors going forward in the future. So their measures of success are very different. Their measures of success are how much are people being able to reassume the job functions and the life functions and integration into schools and find their way back to normal life. So it's much more focused on behavior. Uzbekistan, again, I know these are generalizations, but I think they're productive generalizations that can help understand the different approaches, has kind of a model of organic reintegration, organic reabsorption. They're very much focused on the communities that are bringing people back. And for those who know the region and know Uzbekistan well, the venerable institution of the Mahala, which is, I think, for Western observers, a combination of neighborhood community and church parish and community center and Kiwanis club, sort of everything all wrapped together, is able to provide on the very local level the kind of preventative oversight and intervention that they feel is going to be successful in bringing these people and reintegrating them back. So I would say, on that spectrum, you've got sort of a vision in Kazakhstan of de-radicalization, a vision of communal reintegration in Uzbekistan, and a model of individual behavior change in Tajikistan. In terms of the issues that have come up, we've had several conferences and activities through our C5+1, Central Asia 5+1 security line of effort work at USIP that we do with State Department funding, bringing together the caregivers and the officials responsible from the three countries, plus Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. What we found is, I think, beyond these models of reintegration, a common set of problems that represent gaps and opportunities for support for international development actors and for technical assistance from the outside. The first of these, whether you are de-radicalized or not de-radicalized, whether you were a true believer in ISIS or not a true believer in ISIS, there's a trauma problem, a PTSD problem that people have experienced from having lived in the Islamic State and seen the things in the Islamic State that we all know and despise on a regular basis. They lived through the very ugly war that ended the Islamic State, and then they suffered through the sorts of things that Chopin was talking about in the camps. All of those things lead to trauma issues, especially pediatric trauma issues, that the healthcare and social support networks in Central Asia aren't really prepared to deal with. So what you've identified, first of all, is a real gap in trauma-aware care, especially trauma-aware care, not just in the professional psychologist and social worker area, but also among teachers, among police, among community leaders, among religious leaders. How do you identify and see the signs of trauma in children and in women who have come back, and how do you address those using some of the methods that we all know, unfortunately, in America from dealing with PTSD issues that we've seen over the recent past. Secondly, we see a gap in the ability of the institutions, especially the educational institutions in Central Asia, to do meaningful gap analysis on how far back the kids are who are coming in from the Islamic State. Whatever you want to say about the Islamic State and the camps in Syria, they're not very good at, K to 6 education. And so there are both the developmental organic problems that come from trauma that might put you behind in your schoolwork, and then there are simply gaps in what education you've been exposed to, if any at all, among the kids. And there are also some language issues which are tough, because these kids come back speaking Russian and or Arabic, but probably not Tajik when they come back. So there are those educational issues as a second one. Third is, again, beyond the de-radicalization sort of issue, what about social work? What about sort of long-term capacity to do monitoring and tracking? We all know, and I think, it's a characteristic of the Central Asian states, that the security forces are able to track. The police and national security agencies are perfectly capable of tracking, 1,000 people and making sure that they don't deviate. But in terms of social work, in terms of being able to intervene with kids when their behavior is perhaps sending them off in a direction that they don't want to go, there's really no long-term capacity in the region to do that long-term social work. So that's another issue, a gap that we've been looking at. And then finally, looking beyond sort of the health issues of the individuals that have come back, we've really seen a problem with stigma and stigmatization of the returnees in the larger community. As one government official from the region mentioned to me, we've got a credibility problem because state media for the last 5-6 years has been demonizing the people who went to Iraq and Syria from Central Asia as Salafi Wahhabi zombies, as mentally defective, as inferior people. As another of the regional officials told me, we really didn't expect any of them to come back alive. And that kind of leaves them with a credibility gap. We've been, suddenly telling these people, describing these people in this way. Now suddenly we're turning around and we're saying, no, it turns out in reality, they're just lost little sheep that we're going to bring back into the loving embrace of the motherland, and look at these wonderful pictures of people getting off the plane and kissing the ground. The longer term problem is, how well the communities that are actually absorbing them are prepared to absorb them, but also how the larger society around them are willing to. And I think Anne was sort of hinting a little bit at this. I think some of the worries that government officials involved with this have in Central Asia now is, if 85 orphans come back and 84 of them do really well and reintegrate and become solid citizens, and one of them becomes a crime boss, that's the story that's going to get out. That's the story that that's the stereotype that people are going to get. So one of the things that we see as a real gap is how to put a human face on the returnees, how to tell the story of how they got there and how they got back, the good and the bad and the ugly, to give a more realistic picture of what reintegration is going to look like. I think the state media, which dominates in the region, has really made this look like a triumphal return. Literally people coming off the plane from the desert and kissing the ground, and I think they're trying to tell a really happy story, when in fact what we know is that both for the kids trying to reintegrate into a normal school environment, and for the women who are being brought back into the communities that they left from, it's not always going to be a happy story. So finally, one of the things that I think has, like everything else in our lives, impacted is COVID. A lot of the interventions, a lot of the areas of intervention that I identified have been, basically stopped over the last few months by on and off again shutdowns. So, the returnees are very much in the same boat as everybody else. When there's a lockdown, they're locked down at home, and being able to provide them with the psychosocial support, provide them with social worker support, provide them with training in how to reestablish livelihoods is largely stopped, and they're still in that. And finally, I think the last thing I would say is, on the long term, as we look forward over the next couple of decades with returnees, I'm actually a little bit more concerned about other problems and other vectors. I don't necessarily worry, I don't stay up at night thinking that the kids who are coming back from the Islamic State will become little cells of cubs of the caliphate ready to be reactivated. I think what's more threatening is what those cleavages and divisions and sort of vectors of violence in Central Asia that pre-exist are, and how those present opportunities. So I would think, the skill set and background and nervous systems of a lot of these kids might find an outlet in joining criminal organized crime organizations in places like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where their ability to organize milk money rackets in schools can be played into joining organized crime groups, which are a little bit more prevalent. There are outlets for that. There's a rise in nativist and nationalist sentiment in Central Asia, which occasionally has a violent ethnic or anti-Chinese bent, which also sort of provides these outlets. So I'm sort of more worried about what some of those other attractors of grievance might be than the Islamic State. And I think our focus has been, and will continue to be, on how we make this a successful model, how we help the communities and the governments of the region to make these reintegrations a success, because we really don't want to sort of see a lot of bad stereotypes developing about the returnees.